Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. It's the Capital Connection this week. Joining us is David Lombardo, host of the Capital Press Room. David, of course, host of WCNY's public affairs television program, Connect New York. Served as the Capital reporter for the Albany Times-Union. I could go on and on and on. Welcome back, David.
Thanks for having me, David.
It's so great to have you. Well, there's an interesting thing that happened this week. We have a budget. Oh, well, sort of. $254 billion state budget. But let's just remind everyone, it's not done. They're still voting on things. There's other things to be considered. And really, that might not happen until next week.
Yeah, we have a conceptual framework, handshake deal, whatever euphemism you want to use on the real big picture priorities of the governor and the legislature. But there are a lot of I's to dot, a lot of T's to cross. And as we're speaking on Thursday, it appears that the legislature is going to pass a budget extender, something to keep the budget funding in the interim before probably coming back next week to adopt a budget for the entire fiscal year, which runs through March 31st of next year. But as we speak, we haven't actually seen bill text yet, and we're waiting on about 9 budget bills.
Yeah, well, before we get into that, let's talk about the governor and what she's been pushing all along, the so-called affordability agenda. She said she got everything she wanted. Did she?
Yeah, in terms of the headlines, yes, she got exactly what she wanted. There are some tweaks to her proposals. For example, a rebate check has been scaled back a little bit in terms of its scope and what people will actually see and who's going to qualify. But what people need to know is basically if you're a family, you could be getting a check of up to $400. If you're an individual, it's up to $300, and this is based on your earnings from fiscal year 2023. And I think it's about 8 million filers who are going to be covered by this. So this is going to be one of those issues in the budget that has the largest reach. Whether people, when they realize that check in their bank account, are going to associate it with the state budget, whether they're going to associate it with Kathy Hochul is another thing. But that's definitely going to be real money in real people's pockets.
Well, I'm almost worried that the word reckless is going to be used eventually. Now, we see that the federal government is cutting things and that everybody I talk to now expects to be in a special session at some point to revisit what's going to happen. They've sort of just been going along with the idea we'll wait and see and we'll still plan the budget accordingly. But then I see this headline that came out from WNYC's Jimmy Vielkind, our colleague, that now the governor wants more power to adjust the budget to in case of federal cuts. And that, to me, is a power move.
It's a power move, but it's not a new one in Albany. Chief executives always want as much latitude over state spending as possible, and they already actually have a lot of discretion in terms of when money's going to go out the door, if money's going to go out the door. And we saw this in the past with Governor Andrew Cuomo. During the pandemic, he wanted more power, and the legislature typically gives it to them because, not to speak ill of the legislature, but they like having an adult in the room. They don't want to be the one to make the tough choices when those tough choices need to be made, and they can then point to the second floor and say, hey, it's not us that rolled back some of your school aid. It's not us who limited some of your healthcare dollars. It's the governor. So I think it's likely that the governor's going to want some sort of discretionary power. But if we're talking about serious cuts at the federal level, then the legislature is going to actually have to come back in the fall, and they're going to have to be involved just because the scope of things is too great for the governor to act on alone.
Now, I see we have a new charge for wearing a mask while committing a crime.
Yeah, so this is one of those areas where the governor is going to talk for the headlines and say, I got what I wanted, which was restrictions on masks, but it's not exactly what she wanted. She felt in the wake of protests the last couple years that masks had been used as a way to intimidate protected classes of people, for example, Jews in New York City and on college campuses. And what ended up being part of this budget deal is basically if you're committing a crime and in the commission of that crime, you're wearing a mask, that's basically a penalty enhancer. And what was interesting to me was that we saw this as a progressive criminal justice issue in terms of the opposition, but what ultimately seemed to be more meaningful in stopping the governor and what her agenda was labor unions, who apparently wanted the authority to be able to continue to protest, say, a work site and wear a mask so they could retain their anonymity. And here in Albany, I think you can always count on labor unions to have more sway than progressive criminal justice advocates. So I really think that's one of those interesting issues where a opponent that we maybe weren't counting on 6 months into this debate emerged and was the real game changer.
Let's go to discovery. This is a huge issue. It's been going on for a while. It started with a lot of Republican criticism of bail reform. The governor seems to have tried to meet this where it is, and that's the evidence, right, that goes when a crime is committed. And many of the DAs were complaining for a while that that's too much of a bar to reach. They're understaffed. It's a lot of evidence they have to provide. They wanted some sort of middle ground. She seems to have worked that in.
Yeah, so the changes to pretrial evidence disclosure that was enacted in 2019, took effect in 2020, was a real game changer in terms of the dynamic between criminal defense attorneys and prosecutors. And the criminal defense attorneys would say that it was restoring a correct balance in terms of the access to evidence that they needed. What we've heard from prosecutors in the ensuing 5 years is essentially that the scales were tipped too far in the benefit of criminal defense attorneys, essentially giving them the ability to get cases tossed out as a result of technical errors, and judges didn't have enough wiggle room, so to speak, to say, okay, well, the prosecutors were trying their best and we should give them a little extra latitude. I should say criminal defense attorneys completely disagree with this framing of the issue and say that there already are avenues for prosecutors who are acting in good faith to ensure their cases are allowed to proceed. And they also point to the fact that a number of pretrial dismissals as a result of this statute is only been increased in New York City, and in the 57 other counties, you haven't really seen this same trend. But here is one of those issues where the governor was very successful in getting a version of what she wanted. And when I say what she wanted, I mean the district attorneys who were basically taking the lead on this. And based on the reporting and based on talking with Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie, it seems like it finally got resolved when Speaker Hastie, a Bronx Democrat, sat down with the New York City prosecutors and basically hammered out a deal that everyone could agree to.
Why the trend in New York City? Is it because there's more volume of cases?
It's not really clear why, Dave. I think it could be the volume of cases. It could be the way their offices are set up. One of the issues that was raised in advance of this budget being agreed to, so to speak, was this idea that the NYPD is not getting evidence over to prosecutors in a timely fashion. And so State Senator Zellner Myrie, a Brooklyn Democrat who's actually running for mayor of New York City, had proposed some legislation to basically increase the speed and ease at which evidence can flow from the NYPD to prosecutors' offices.
Well, you mentioned New York City. Let's stay there for a minute, the mayoral race. Looks like Andrew Cuomo, the former governor, is running away with it in the polls.
Yeah, with, I guess, now less than 2 months until primary day, Andrew Cuomo, the former governor who resigned in 2021, a Queens boy, as he would like us to think of him, is in the lead position by a wide margin based on all the polls. And it seems like his only challenger at this point is another Queens boy, Zoran Mamdani, an assembly member, a Democrat who's a part of the Democratic Socialists of America, and has really separated himself from the other more progressive challengers, I think largely with his really effective and persuasive media campaign that has created this economic populism message that's really resonated with a lot of people, but he's still facing a huge uphill battle because his name's Zoran Mamdani and people don't know who the heck he is, and Andrew Cuomo is a household name for a lot of people. And I think despite any concerns that were raised in 2021 about sexual harassment, the handling of the pandemic, and his general leadership of New York State, there seems to be a warm feeling and confidence in him that I think is probably going to carry carry him to victory.
I wonder what New York State Attorney General Letitia James was thinking when she saw that poll come out, because, she's battled with the governor. They used to be allies. Then there was his issue in the office. She was part of that prosecution. She has said she can get along and work with anybody since it looks like he may take it. But you've got already a tough relationship between the state attorney general and what could be the new mayor of New York City.
Yeah, and Letitia James, a Brooklyn Democrat, has actually endorsed one of the governor's challengers, New York City Council Speaker Adrian Adams. Not necessarily a surprise that they're very close. So it'll be interesting to see who else she sort of backs, given the ranked choice voting, which allows you to essentially make really 5 meaningful endorsements. But yeah, Letitia James has a very controversial relationship with Andrew Cuomo. She basically broke with him on his narrative about nursing homes. She broke with him on his narrative of sexual harassment. And I have to say, the governor's people were, the former governor's people, I should say, were very excited to see some of her legal challenges at the federal level, which include a criminal referral for some housing paperwork, which may or may not actually go anywhere.
That's interesting to me, though, because you see President Trump, who has not, been nice, let's say, in his words toward the state attorney general for what he perceives as her direct attack on him and said it was political. Now he's sort of flipped the tables. Now we hear about these kinds of things all the time where someone puts their legal residency as somewhere else in order to get a deal. So there could be trouble here for the attorney general.
There could be trouble. And then there's 2 things to think about with that. There's real trouble and perceived trouble. And when we think about the case that the attorney general brought against the president, I guess he was former president at the time, that civil case was kind of a smoking gun of sorts, because there was a lot of documentation. The documentation was clear, it was consistent, and the scope of it was worth millions of dollars. Here, the story is a little more complicated in the sense that it's a story, in some cases, that dates back 40 years. So the statute of limitations on a lot of these is expired. Paperwork was updated in certain cases so that problems were rectified. The scope of some of these so-called benefits that you might realize from saying you have a 4-unit apartment building versus a 5-unit apartment building are pretty small in nature, but it comes back to real and perceived problems. So real problems, maybe not that much. Maybe in a traditional federal Department of Justice, the Attorney General wouldn't really have to worry too much about these, but in these sort of uncharted times that we're in right now, it's not really clear how Attorney General at the U.S. level, Pam Bondi, might go after these maybe minor offenses, maybe serious in the views of the Trump administration.
Well, it's going to be interesting no matter what. Let's talk about the MTA for a minute. Large employers in New York City and the suburbs will see a tax hike to help fund the MTA.
Yeah, so this speaks to the capital needs of the New York City area transit system. I think they have a $68 billion program they're looking to get funded. And it should be clear that we're not necessarily looking to raise $68 billion through new taxes. This is basically a way to leverage additional borrowing, basically saying, here's the money that we're good for. And this is an issue that has scarred Democrats in the past. So for listeners who are old enough to remember back to 2009, 2010, when Dave
That's all our listeners.
Okay, good. Well, I was saying Dave and I were just young pups back then.
No, sir. No, sir. I was born in 1969.
Okay,
I wasn't a young pup.
I was trying to loop you in with me,
no,
but okay.
Can't do it. Can't do it.
So at that time, they had some real funding issues for the MTA as well, and they passed some taxes in the area on businesses in the area representing the MTA, and it really came back to hurt the Senate Democrats in particular in the 2010 elections. And this go around, I think they're much more careful about the proposal. As you said, it's limited to larger employers. They're actually trying to frame this as a tax cut for some of the smaller employers in the area. And I've just been shocked by how little oxygen in the room has been dedicated to this conversation. Really, for the last month and change, it's just been kind of a foregone conclusion that there would be some sort of revenue raised for the MTA. And even the Senate and Assembly Republicans have not been crowing about this as much as I would have thought. Maybe that's because there's so much else going on in Albany right now, and there's a long time before the 2026 general election, so this could come up before then. But yeah, as of right now, it appears to have a deal worked out for those budget bills that, again, we haven't seen yet on how to fund the capital needs.
And then there's congestion pricing, question mark.
Yeah, I think this is one of those issues that is going to end up in the court because we've got a state government led by Governor Kathy Hochul that is stuck on putting in congestion pricing. They say they've got the legal authority to do so. And you have a federal government where the Transportation Secretary Duffy either has real objections to it or just has ideological objections to this governor and is trying to push back. And we keep seeing delays in the lines in the sand that the federal government is drawing over congestion pricing. But
they push the deadlines back.
Again, well, you got 20 days to explain. Well, 30 days to explain why that explanation wasn't good. And, I don't know what the next delay will be, but I imagine this has to end up in the courts eventually.
We're speaking with David Lombardo, host of the Capitol Press Room for WCNY. Now, you mentioned early on, David, that there's 9 pieces of legislation we're still trying to work out in this budget process. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of those.
Yeah, so the way that the state budget works is it's a package of bills. I think it's about 10 bills now, and some of them are what are called appropriation bills. Those are the bills that have the money in them. And then there are what are called Article 7 bills, and those are the bills that are actually responsible for more of the holdup this year because they include policy. So while we think of the budget as just a fiscal document, in recent years there's been a trend to pack more and more and more policy into this budget document. And so a couple weeks ago we had the passage of the debt services bill. This is a non-controversial bill. It's one that does not get amended really since initially being introduced. And what we'll see now in the following weeks is finishing documents in terms of these Article 7 bills, the appropriation bills, but we'll also see scaled back versions from what was initially proposed. They might remove a controversial environmental issue from the environmental budget bill. They'll remove a controversial transportation bill from the transportation bill. And then all of these sort of controversial things will end up in a final Article 7 bill, which will be called a big ugly, so to speak. It's an omnibus bill where they pack in a lot of the good things, a lot of the bad things, so that way people are kind of incentivized to vote for it, so to speak. Well, if you want school funding, well, you're going to have to go for this MTA tax. And, if you wanted that discovery reform, well, you're also going to have to vote for something you don't like. And it's the way of the budget really for the last decade plus now.
So where's the HEAT Act in all of this?
The HEAT Act
doesn't look good.
No, the HEAT Act, and this is legislation that has a couple components to it, including basically ending subsidies for gas hookups, as well as imposing restrictions on what people are required to pay for their utility bills moving forward. This is something that's had traction in the Senate. It has not gotten a vote in the Assembly. The governor has sometimes sort of endorse parts of this proposal, which has found its way into her budget proposal. I don't anticipate any of this language is going to be in a final budget, although there will be probably $1 billion spread out over the next 5 years for energy and environmental projects, and some of that could go towards energy bill relief. It remains to be seen how that money is actually allocated. When we finish this budget, we're going to have about a month left to go in the legislative session, and that period is when environmentalists are going to be pushing as hard as they can to get the HEAT Act across the finish line. But I still think that's a pretty heavy lift, with people being very skeptical about the ramifications of this. I mean, people in the Assembly are supportive of, say, capping what people pay for their energy bills, and there are programs designed to provide relief, particularly for low-income New Yorkers, but they have a lot of concerns about the other changes in terms of utilities and their infrastructure.
Absolutely. The Republicans have been hammering on them on this very issue. Now, you have something that's already a Climate Superfund Act, and that is being threatened by the federal government as well. If you take the federal government now, just on the environment piece, we've got problems in New York. Don't forget, Lee Zeldin, former congressman, gubernatorial candidate, is now leading the EPA, and he seemed to take the P out of there, the protection part. Immediately announced he was taking these regulations down. So, I mean, when it comes to New York and its environmental legislation, there are some real threats here, or at the very least, pausing, not getting the money through, being delayed, being caught up in court action, whatever it might be.
Yeah, you raise a couple points that highlight the influence of the federal government on New York's environmental landscape. So, number one and most tangible is money. They can cut off the tap, so to speak, on different environmental and energy programs, which I think are going to have a significant impact on our effort to hit our renewable energy goals as we think about some of the subsidies that are cut off for green energy projects, as well as, say, more environmentally friendly appliances. There have been a lot of money where the state serves as the administrator of it, but it's federal dollars. And then in terms of regulations, there are some times where the state can go beyond maybe what it might be expected to do with its constitutional powers and its federal relationship. And so in those cases, the EPA might try to slap them down, so to speak, and say, no, you're exceeding your authority. This is something where we have the last say, so to speak. And then I think you also will see in some areas where the federal government maybe rolls back some of its environmental protections or chooses not to be aggressive in their enforcement, you may see some state Democrats say, well, we need to fill that gap. And if they're not going to regulate XYZ, maybe we're going to have to try to step in and fill that gap. So there's a lot to this evolving picture.
Well, and then you talk about enforcement. I mean, you have the Department of Environmental Conservation, which alone struggles with enforcement, not having enough staff. And Governor Hochul, if I'm correct, indicated after the Lee Zeldin announcement that New York will do whatever it can through the DEC to protect New York's environment. That's a huge ask.
Oh, yeah. And when we think about the context of the Department of Environmental Conservation, this is an office that was really decimated, winding again to that 2009-2010 period, by the budgets following the Great Recession. And in recent years, they've seen increases in their personnel allotments, but they've also seen increases in what they've been asked to do. So we think about the green legislation, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in 2019. They've had to begin overseeing the implementation of that, as well as little things along the way, like the enforcement on restrictions of plastic bags, excuse me. And so while their numbers are increasing, their mandate is increasing. So if the governor is serious about the state stepping in to fill that void, you're going to have to see a serious commitment to the personnel side of things. And I don't expect to see a dramatic increase in this year's state budget in terms of the DEC's staffing allotment.
We're speaking with David Lombardo, host of the Capitol Press Room on WCNY. The issue of money itself that we get as a result of the stock market. When it does well, New York does well. When it doesn't do well, New York loses money on that. Now we're talking about, in many ways, the state comptroller, Tom DiNapoli, who's warned about the issues that are up and coming. Things still look okay right now, I guess. But, you know, if we're going to cut Medicaid by $20 billion, if we have a stock market issue, you know, rainy day funds are there for a reason, and yet we haven't accessed that.
Yeah, so the rainy day funds, if you're fiscally conservative, you think about them as one-time money to address a one-time issue, and you don't want to use them for, say, structural imbalances. So if the federal government sort of resets our relationship with the state government and says, hey, from now on, you're only getting X amount of dollars for Medicaid as opposed to what you were getting in the past, most fiscal experts would say you don't want to tap into the rainy day funds for that because this is not a one-day problem. It looks like we're going to have rain for the foreseeable future. Now, if you have a off year in terms of the stock market or something in terms of personal income taxes, or you have something like the pandemic again, where you have these one-time expenses, then they argue, sure, tap into the $15 billion or so that New York has put aside. And at this point, there doesn't seem to be any, I would say, interest by the governor to tap into those reserves. In fact, the narrative that she's been using is I'm putting more money into the reserves. And you know, there are one-time costs, I think, that you could make an argument that it's worth paying off right now. For example, the state has, I think, a $6 billion outstanding debt to the federal government for our unemployment insurance program. We took out a lot of money as a result of the pandemic to pay record levels of unemployment, and that debt matters for two reasons. One, it means that there's increased costs for businesses who need to pay off this debt, and two, it means that we can't increase are unemployment benefits, which have been stagnant now for 5 years. So I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn that if you were to go on unemployment, the maximum benefit you could get is about $500. That's about $26,000 for the entire year. If New York had paid off its unemployment debt immediately in the wake of the pandemic, we would have seen that amount increase gradually to, I think, in excess of $800. If the math is right in my head, I think it's about maybe $900 almost. I mean, $400 a week is a big difference if you are out of work.
David Lombardo, let's move to colleges and universities and the issues therein. Again, the federal government coming down hard on universities and colleges, especially those they feel have encouraged, quote, anti-Semitism. There's been a lot of protests about the war in Gaza. And some universities have caved a bit under the pressure. You mentioned earlier unions and their power in New York. And I know you spoke with Fred Cole, the president of UUP, who says, they want a seat at the table to argue against what the federal government is doing to disrupt the status quo on colleges.
Yeah, we talked with the union representing faculty and staff for the SUNY schools, and they feel like the SUNY chancellor, John King, as well as the leader of the CUNY system in New York City, should be more aggressive in confronting President Donald Trump and the federal administration over some of their policies, which they see as an attack on higher ed, particularly as it comes to, say, academic freedom and freedom to, say, pursue the research that they want to do and have the campus dialogues that they want to have. And they argue basically that by being quiet, being on the sidelines, so to speak, that it is going to embolden the Trump administration, that only by standing up together with other schools, other colleges, with other chancellors, and having some sort of coordinated defense, can you force the Trump administration to back down? And there may be some truth to that. If we look at the way Harvard responded when the president and his administration tried to put them on their back foot, I think that was pretty successful. And I think it sort of changed the dynamic a little bit. At the same time...
And it took some time, it seems to me, David, for some of these places to get their sea legs.
Yes. And I think, though, the alternative argument to be made is that by making yourself visible, you also make yourself a target. And maybe the president's going to focus on SUNY and some of our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Maybe they'll have issues with some of our policies supporting transgender students. And I think that it remains to be seen what is the best policy moving forward. But the union for SUNY staff and professors thinks that the answer is clear and that it means standing up and working with colleges and campuses all over the country.
We could just continue to talk and talk and talk. David Lombardo, host of the Capitol Press Room for WCNY on this week's Capitol Connection. I really appreciate the conversation, and I only hope you'll be available the next time I call.
If you want me, I'll answer the phone.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Support for the Capitol Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative.